Alright, so today we're going to look at environmental sociology, which is a new branch within sociology that looks at how technology is negatively impacting the environment and how it's directly connected to the cultures that a group develops. Alright, so first let's look at a simple definition of what exactly is environmental sociology. Alright, what it does is it tries to find a connection between human cultures and the impact it has on the environment. We know as populations are growing, because we have better technology, because we have better medications that are available, well, people are living longer. And because people are living longer, our world population has grown exponentially. Well, because we have more people around, that means we have more waste that's in the street. There's more trash that we need to get rid of. So where does all of that go? Right? Because we are product-based in the industrial age or the post-industrial age. Well, these factories that are producing our products, they're putting pollutants and toxins out into the water, into the air, into the soil. And so because of that, it's hurting the environment. There's more erosion to the ozone level. There's more deforestation. Right? So what the environmental sociologists look at is this value of growth at any cost and how it's changed based off of what we know we're doing to the environment. Right? We are now passing more rules and restrictions on emissions, and so we don't want as many carbon emissions going into the air, so you need to get your car tested once a year or twice a year depending on where in the world you're living. All right, companies, they need to show that they're not putting too many pollutants or toxins out into the environment, and so there are actually limits and restrictions on what they can do. And so what environmental sociologists would look at is where these value shifts are coming from and what the culture is doing and how that might impact the environment. So let's look at the foundations behind environmental sociology and why they are more powerful now, and it's a big field within the realm of sociology. All right, so what we have are three different levels of nations and how they've been developed and evolved. Right, so most industrialized nations, we would put them at the top of the political, economic, global sphere. Right, they have a lot of control politically and economically because they're producing the main technology that people want, which means they can produce the main product that people need. Right, within most industrialized nations, this would be like the United States is one, England is one, Germany is one. They are these foundations of multinational corporations that are able to produce the main product that people want, which in a post-industrialized age is we want information, we want facts. And so they are producing these highly desirable products like your smartphones or your tablets or your computers that people desire and need because it gives them direct access to that product of main information. Right? Our industrializing nations, they're trying to play catch up. They're moving into a post-industrialized age, but they aren't there just yet. And so for them, they're still powerful politically and economically, but they're doing so at the cost of their environment. What they're doing is trying to build better factories to create that product that we want, and they're sacrificing their environments, air quality or soil in order to get there. So for example, Russia or China, these are industrializing nations. They're very powerful politically and economically on a global scale, but if you look at their local environments and what they're doing, it's hurting it more than helping it. Right? The very bottom of our global social structure would be the least industrialized nations. Right? These are the ones that have a lot of the raw goods that everybody wants because the raw materials, those raw goods, are what help them create the finished product that everyone wants. Right? But they don't have the power on a political or global scale. They don't have the economic control that the other nations have. If we were going to think back to our deviance unit, right, these least industrialized nations would be like our marginalized working class. Right? They're the ones that are most likely to be taken advantage of, and they're the ones that are most likely to put their environment at greatest risk. Right? So if you look at this map here, All right, what we see is that the most desirable raw materials are in the areas that are also represented by the least industrialized nations. They haven't developed very far. All right. In order to protect the environment, what we find is that the most industrialized, that's what MIN stands for, and the industrialized nations, that's what IN stands for, are working together to try and change our standards, right? These most industrialized and industrialized nations, they've been taking advantage of the least industrialized. They've been going in kind of looting and stealing all of their raw materials. So if you look at that stage of colonization, that's kind of what happened. The most industrialized nations, they took advantage of those that weren't industrialized. They went in and colonized them and controlled them and stole from them and enslaved their populations, and it's been very bad. Right? So there's been changes as we're moving into this post-industrialized age to try and stop that. So we have this Great Eight. That's what G8 stands for. It's the most powerful 8 nations, and this number changes. I've seen it go as high as the Great 14, as low as the Great 5. They meet and they try and set global standards of what we should be doing to protect better human rights and to better protect the environment. Right? Now we can see it going both ways. Right? Are they doing this because they actually want to protect the basic human rights of everyone? By stopping this control, by stopping the stealing of their raw materials, by preventing any pollutants in those regions and changing the way that they work? Or are they setting these global standards because it helps them contain and maintain their current global dominance? Right? The global standards that they're setting don't really impact these most industrialized nations or these industrializing nations, because they've already evolved and moved to that next stage. And it's really only the least industrialized that are being impacted by these restrictions on how much toxins they can put out into the environment, how much they can grow and change and develop their factory productions. Right? They're impacted because they aren't at the most industrialized levels. The most industrialized, they don't have to worry about toxins and factories because they aren't really in their countries anymore. They're being outsourced to other nations, and therefore it's impacting those countries more than them. And so maybe these global standards are actually just to preserve the status quo and not really to help those that are at the lower spectrum of the social structure. Right? In order to make sure that these changes are controlled, is we need to make sure that there's political agendas that are being addressed. And so usually the Great Eight will take their meanings, their ideas, their proposals to the United Nations and try and get them passed. Right? So for example, the Paris Agreement. That was a document that was created to restrict negative impacts on the environment. So each country that signed the Paris Agreement, they came up with their own plan for what their country should do to help preserve the environment. We're going to restrict plastic and cut down on single-use plastic use. Or we're going to limit carbon emissions, and therefore we're going to cut down on our CO2 levels by X%. Right? By using the United Nations, there's some political control, but there's really no enforcement. If a country doesn't want to sign, then they don't sign. Right? So, for example, the United States originally signed the Paris Agreement, but when President Trump was elected, we removed our signature and we changed our policies because Trump thought it was negatively impacting job growth within that country. Right? The jobs were more important than the environment, and so that's where they started to address the needs, sometimes at the sacrifice of the environment. Right? So we have these global political units, and they really only get involved when it's deemed most important to them, which means the United States, which is one of those Great Eight nations, us removing our signature from the Paris Agreement, no one could get involved because it wasn't really that important. That controlling vote of the United States was deemed more significant to keep involved with our different political agendas rather than attacking them for negatively impacting the environment. Right, we do know that our technological growth does have an impact on the environment that we live in. Right? For example, carbon emissions that I've talked about a lot. Right? Well, that's like the exhaust from your car. Right? By doing this, it actually wears away at the ozone layer, which means there's more negative UV rays that are getting through and raising the earth temperature. So, for example, polar ice caps are melting. The world is getting hotter and hotter, which means some of our plants can't grow as much because how we're changing the environment and the ecosystems to raise it above a certain level. Because of these carbon emissions that are in the air, we also have higher rates of acid rain, right? The toxins that are in the higher stratospheres, well, when it rains back down to Earth, it's creating acid. Not as much to like melt your skin off, but it's wearing away at our buildings, at our cars, at the local lakes and rivers, where it's actually putting acid back into the system. And so it's negatively impacting the earth. Not even just our air or water supplies, but it's also hurting our local animals, right? As our populations are growing, we're moving into more rural areas, which means these areas that were natural animal habitats are now being developed into new homes or businesses or schools. And these animals that once lived there are being displaced. And so because of that, they're either going extinct at higher rates or we're having more risks of animal attacks. All right, so for example, when Good Counsel was originally built, right, it was a giant field. And when Good Counsel was built, our first few years, we had a horrible mice infestation because those fields were where the mice were living. And when the building went up, these mice stayed, and so they just kind of camped out and lived in the building. We had to go through different means to trap them and remove them from the school building. So your religion classroom or your language classroom on the first floor, just imagine like a little mouse running across the room as you're trying to learn. Like it was funny, but also horrible at the same time. There are bears that are native to Maryland, and as we've grown into further and further rural areas, there are more bear attacks. If you watch the news, since humans are now sheltering at home, there's sightings of wild animals that we didn't realize were living in our communities because they can now roam freely without the fear of humans being out there. For example, one of my friends sent me a video the other day of just a coyote wandering across her backyard. Like, oh my goodness. Right, so what environmental sociologists would look at is this direct link between the growth of the nations and the environment and what's happening to them. Right, so use this audio lecture to use your notes for today. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or Zoom in. Or if not, have a great day. Sorry.